The Western Philosophy, Chapter 8, Section 4, Biology, the Evolution of Life, from page 412 to page 424. The second and third volumes of the Synthetic Philosophy appeared in 1872 under the title of Principles of Biology. They revealed the natural limitations of a philosopher invading a specialist field, but they atoned for errors or denials by illuminating generalizations that gave a new unity and intelligibility to vast areas of biological fact. Spencer begins with a famous definition. Life is the continuous adjustment of internal relations to external relations. The completeness of life depends on the completeness of his correspondence, and life is perfect when the correspondence is perfect. The correspondence is not a merely passive adaptation. What distinguishes life is the adjustment of internal relations in anticipation of a change in external relations. As when an animal crouches to avoid a blow, or a man makes a fire to warm his food. The defect of the definition lies not merely in its tendency to neglect the remolding activity of the organism upon the environment, but in its failure to explain what is that subtle power whereby an organism is enabled to make these prophetic adjustments that characterize vitality. In the chapter added to later editions, Spencer was forced to discuss the dynamic element in life and to admit that his definition had not really revealed the nature of life. We are obliged to confess that life in its essence cannot be conceived in physical chemical terms. 3G. He did not realize how damaging such an admission was to the unity and completeness of his system. As Spencer sees in the life of the individual an adjustment of internal to external relations, so he sees in the life of the species a remarkable adjustment of reproductive fertility to the conditions of its habitat. Reproduction arises originally as a readaptation of the nutritive surface. To the nourished mass, the growth of an amoeba, for example, involves an increase of mass much more rapid than the increase in the surface through which the mass must get its nourishment. Division, budding, spore formation, and sexual reproduction have this in common, that the ratio of mass to surface is reduced and the nutritive balance is restored. Hence, the growth of the individual organism beyond a certain point is dangerous, and normally growth gives way after a time to reproduction. On the average, growth varies inversely with the rate of energy expenditure, and the rate of reproduction varies inversely with the degree of growth. It is well known to breeders that if a filly is allowed to bear a foal, she is thereby prevented from reaching her proper size. As a converse fact, castrated animals, as capons and notably cats, often become larger than their unmutilated associates. The rate of reproduction tends to fall as the development and capability of the individual progress. When, from lowness of organization, the ability to contend with external dangers is small, there must be great fertility to compensate for the consequent mortality. Otherwise, the race must die out. When, on the contrary, high endurance give much capacity for self-preservation, a correspondingly low degree of fertility is requisite, lest the rate of multiplication should outrun the supply of food. In general, then, there is an opposition of individuation and genesis, or individual development and fertility. The rule holds for groups and species more regularly than development seems hostile to fertility. Where exceptional fertility exists, there is sluggishness of mind, and where there has been, during education, excessive expenditure in mental action, there frequently follows a complete or partial infertility. Hence, the particular kind of further evolution which man is hereafter to undergo is one which, more than any other, may be expected to cause a decline in his power of reproduction. Philosophers are notorious for shirking parentage In woman, on the other hand, the arrival of motherhood normally brings a diminution of intellectual activity, and perhaps her shorter adolescence is due to her earlier sacrifice to reproduction. Despite this approximate adaptation of birth rate to the needs of group survival, the adaptation is never complete, and Malthus was right in his general principle that population tends to outrun the means of subsistence. From the beginning, this pressure of population has been the proximate cause of progress. It produced the original diffusion of the race. It compelled men to abandon predatory habits and take to agriculture. It led to the clearing of the earth's surface. It forced man into the social state and developed the social sentiments. It has stimulated to progressive improvements in production and to increased skill and intelligence. It is the chief cause of that struggle for existence through which the fittest are enabled to survive, and through which the level of the race is raised. Whether the survival of the fittest is due chiefly to spontaneous favorable variations or to the partial inheritance of characters or capacities repeatedly acquired by successive generations is a question on which Spencer took no dogmatic stand. He accepted Darwin's theory gladly, but felt that there were facts which it could not explain, and which compelled a modified acceptance of Lamarckian views. He defended Lamarck with fine vigor in his controversy with Weismann, and pointed out certain defects in the Darwinian theory. In those days, Spencer stood almost alone on the side of Lamarck. It is of some interest to note that today the neo-Lamarckians include descendants of Darwin, while the greatest contemporary English biologist gives it as the view of present day students of genetics that Darwin's particular theory, not of course the general theory of evolution, must be abandoned. Address of Sir William Batson before the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Toronto, December 28, 1921. In Science, January 20, 1922. Dig Psychology, The Evolution of Mind. The two volumes on the Principles of Psychology, 1873. are the weakest links in Spencer's chain. There has been an earlier volume on the subject, 1855, a youthfully vigorous defense of materialism and determinism, but age and thought revised this into a milder form and padded it out with hundreds of pages of painstaking but illuminating analysis. Here, even more than elsewhere, Spencer is rich in theories and poor in proofs. He has a theory of the origin of nerves out of intercellular connective tissue, and a theory of the genesis of instinct by the compounding of reflexes and the transmission acquired character, and a theory of the origin of mental categories out of the experience of the race, and a theory of transfigured realism, and 100 other theories that have all the obfuscation power of metaphysics rather than the clarifying virtue of a matter of fact psychology. In these volumes, we leave realistic England and go back to Kant. What strikes us at once is that for the first time in the history of psychology, we get here a resolutely evolutionist point of view, an attempt at genetic explanations, an effort to trace the bewildering complexities of thought down to the simplest of nervous operations, and finally to the motions of matter. It is true that this effort fails, but who has ever succeeded in such an attempt? Spencer sets out with a magnificent program for the unveiling of the processes whereby consciousness has been evolved. In the end, he is compelled to posit consciousness everywhere in order to evolve it. He insists that there has been one continuous evolution from nebula to mind, and at last confesses that matter is known only through mind. Perhaps the most significant paragraphs in these volumes are those in which the materialist philosophy is abandoned. Spencer means by this that although the objects of experience may very well be transfigured by perception and be quite other than they seem, they have an existence which does not all depend upon perceiving them. Can the oscillations of a molecule be represented in consciousness side by side with a nervous shock, and the two be recognized as one? No effort enables us to assimilate them. That a unit of feeling has nothing in common with a unit of motion becomes more than ever manifest when we bring the two into juxtaposition. And the immediate verdict of consciousness thus given might be analytically justified, for it might be shown that the conception of an oscillation molecule is built out of many units of feeling. Example, our knowledge of matter is built up out of units of mind sensations and memories and ideas. Were we compelled to choose between the alternatives of translating mental phenomena into physical phenomena, or of translating physical phenomena into mental phenomena, the latter alternative would seem the more acceptable of the two. Nevertheless, there is, of course, an evolution of mind, a development of modes of response, from simple to compound to complex, from reflex to tropism to instinct, through memory and imagination to intellect and reason. To the reader who can pass alive through these 1,400 pages of physiological and psychological analysis, there will come an overwhelming sense of the continuity of life and the continuity of mind. He will see us on a retorted cinematograph, the formation of nerves, the development of adaptive reflexes and instincts, and the production of consciousness and thought through the clash of conflicting impulses. Intelligence has neither distinct grades, nor is it constituted by faculties that are truly independent, but its highest manifestations are the effects of a complication that has arisen by insensible steps out of the simplest elements. There is no hiatus between instinct and reason. Each is an adjustment of inner relations to outer relations, and the only difference is one of degree in so far as the relations responded to by instinct are comparatively stereotyped and simple, while those met by reason are comparatively novel and complex. A rational action is simply an instinctive response which has survived in a struggle with other instinctive responses aroused by a situation. Deliberation is merely the internecine strife of rival impulses. At bottom, reason and instinct, mind and life are one. Will is an abstract term which we give to the sum of our active impulses. And a volition is the natural flow of an unimpeded idea into action. An idea is the first stage of an action. An action is the last stage of an idea. Similarly, an emotion is the first stage of an instinctive action, and the expression of the emotion is a useful prelude to the completed response. The baring of the teeth in anger gives a substantial hem or hint of that tearing of the enemy to pieces, which used to be the natural termination of such a beginning. Forms of thought, like the perception of space and time, or the notions of quantity and cause, which Kant supposed innate, are merely instinctive ways of thinking, and as instincts are habits acquired by the race but native to the individual. So these categories are mental habits slowly acquired in the course of evolution and are now part of our intellectual heritage. All these age-long puzzles of psychology can be explained by the inheritance of continually accumulating modifications. It is, of course, just this all pervading assumption that makes so much of these laborious volumes questionable and perhaps vain. Oh, sociology, the evolution of society with sociology, the verdict is quite different. These stout volumes, whose publications ranged over 20 years, are Spencer's masterpiece. They cover his favorite field, and they show him at his best in suggestive generalization and political philosophy. From his first book, Social Statics, to the last fascicle of the principles of sociology over a stretch of almost half a century. His interest is predominantly in the problems of economics and government. He begins and ends, like Plato, with discourses on moral and political justice. No man, not even Comte, founder of the science and maker of the word, has done so much for sociology. In a popular introductory volume, The Study of Sociology, 1873, Spencer argues eloquently for the recognition and development of the new science. If determinism is correct in psychology, there must be regularities of cause and effect in social phenomena, and a thorough student of man and society will not be content with a merely chronological history like Levy's, nor with a biographical history like Carlyle's. He will look in human history for those general lines of development, those causal sequences, those illuminating corre- correlations which transform the wilderness of facts into the chart of science. What biography is to anthropology, history is to sociology. Of course, there are 1,000 obstacles that the study of society must yet overcome before it can deserve the name of science. The young study is harassed by a multitude of prejudices, personal, educational, theological, economic, political, national, religious, and by the ready omniscience of the uninformed. There is a story of a Frenchman who, having been 3 weeks here, proposed to write a book on England, who after 3 months found that he was not quite ready, and who after 3 years concluded that he knew nothing about it. Such a man was ripe to begin the study of sociology. Men prepare themselves with lifelong study before becoming authorities in physics or chemistry or biology, but in the field of social and political affairs, every grocer's boy is an expert, knows the solution, and demands to be heard. Spencer's own preparation in this case was a model of intellectual conscience. He employed 3 secretaries to gather data for him and to classify the data in parallel columns, given the domestic, ecclesiastical, professional, political, and industrial institutions of every significant people. At his own expense, he published these collections in 8 large volumes so that other students might verify or modify his conclusions. And the publication being unfinished at his death, he left part of his little savings to complete the undertaking. After 7 years of such preparations, the first volume of the Sociology appeared in 1876. Not until 1896 was the last one ready, when everything else of Spencer's has become a task for the antiquarian. These 3 volumes will still be rich in reward for every student of society. Nevertheless, the initial conception of the work is typical of Spencer's habit of rushing into generalizations. Society, he believes, is an organism having organs of nutrition, circulation, coordination, and reproduction, very much as in the case of individuals. It is true that cf. budding with colonization and sexual reproduction, with the intermarriage of races in the individual, consciousness is localized, while in society each of the parts retains its own consciousness and its own will. But the centralization of government and authority tends to reduce the scope of this distinction. A social organism is like an individual organism in these essential traits: that it grows, that while growing it becomes more complex, that while becoming more complex its parts acquire increasing mutual dependence, that its life is immense in length compared with the lives of its component units, that in both cases there is increasing integration accompanied by increasing heterogeneity. Thus, the development of society liberally carries out the formula of evolution. The growing size of the political unit from family to state and league, and the growing size of the economic unit from petty domestic industry to monopolies and cartels. The growing size of the population unit from village to towns and cities, surely these show a process of integration, while the division of labor, the multiplication of professions and the trades, and the growing economic interdependence of city with country and of nation with nation amply illustrate the development of coherence and differentiation. The same principle of the integration of the heterogeneous applies to every field of social phenomena, from religion and government to science and art. Religion is at first the worship of a multitude of gods and spirits, more or less alike in every nation, and the development of religion comes through the notion of a central and omnipotent deity subordinating the others and coordinating them into their hierarchy of special rules. The first gods were probably suggested by dreams and ghosts. The word spirit was and is applied equally to ghosts and gods. The primitive mind believed that in death or sleep or trance, the ghost or spirit left the body even in a sneeze. The forces of expiration might expel the spirit so that a protective God bless you or its equivalent became attached to this dangerous adventure. Echoes and reflections were so sounds and sights of one's ghost or double. The Basuto refuses to walk by a stream lest a crocodile should seize his shadow and consume it. God was at first only a permanently existing ghost. Persons who had been powerful during their earthly lives were believed to keep their power in their ghostly appearance. Among the Tannis, the word for God means literally a dead man. Jehovah meant the strong one, the warrior. He had been a local potentate, perhaps, who was worshipped after his death as the god of hosts. Such dangerous ghosts had to be propitiated. Funeral rites grew into worship, and all the modes of carrying favor with the earthly chief were applied to the ceremonial of prayer and the appeasement of the gods. Ecclesiastical revenues originated in gifts to the gods, just as state revenues began as presents to the chief. Obeisance to kings became prostration and prayer at the altar of the god. The derivation of the god from the dead king shows clearly in the case of the Romans, who deified rulers before their death. In such ancestor worship, all religion seems to have its origin. The power of this custom may be illustrated by the story of the chief who refused baptism because he was not satisfied with the answer to his query as to whether he would meet his unbaptized ancestors in heaven. Something of this belief entered into the bravery of the Japanese in the War of 1905. Death was made easier for them by the thought that their ancestors were looking down upon them from the skies. Religion is probably the central feature in the life of primitive man. Existence is so precarious and humbled among them that the soul lives rather in the hope of things to come than in the reality of things seen. In some measure, supernatural religion is concomitant of militarist societies as war gives way to industry, thought turns from death to life, and life runs out of the grooves of reverent authority into the open road of initiative and freedom. Indeed, the most far-reaching change that has taken place in all the history of Western society is the gradual replacement of a military by an industrial regime. Students of the state habitually classify societies according as their governments are monarchical, aristocratic, or democratic, but these are superficial distinctions. The great dividing line is that which separates militant from industrial societies, nations that live by war from those that live by work. The military state is always centralized in government and almost always monarchical. The cooperation it inculcates regimental and compulsory. It encourages authoritarian religion, worshipping a warrior god. It develops rigid class distinctions and class codes. It props up the natural domestic absolutism of the male because the death rate is warlike societies is high. They tend to polygamy and a low status of women. Most states have been militant because war strengthens the central power and makes for the subordination of all interests to those of the state. Hence, History is little more than the Newgate calendar of nations, a record of robbery, treachery, murder, and national suicide. Cannibalism is the shame of primitive societies, but some modern societies are sociophagous and enslave and consume whole peoples. Until war is outlawed and overcome, civilization is a precarious interlude between catastrophes. The possibility of a high social state fundamentally depends on the cessation of war. The hope of such a consummation lies not so much in the spiritual conversion of the hearts of men, for men are what the environment makes them, as in the development of industrial societies. Industry makes for democracy and peace. As life ceases to be dominated by war, a thousand centers of economic development arise, and power is beneficently spread over a large portion of the members of the group. Since production can prosper only where initiative is free, an industrial society breaks down those traditions of authority, hierarchy, and caste which flourish in military states and under which military states flourish. The occupation of the soldier ceases to be held in high repute, and patriotism becomes a love of one's country rather than a hatred of every other. Peace at home becomes the first need of prosperity, and as capital becomes international and a thousand investments cross every frontier, international peace becomes a necessity as well. As foreign war diminishes, domestic brutality decreases. Monogamy replaces polygamy because the life tenure of man becomes almost equal to that of women. The status of women rises, and the emancipation of women becomes a matter of course. Today's work is over.